We have a new filming location today. This is the gym I used to train at way back when, and you've probably seen some videos of me with Ryder here. Well, we're back here because it's down the road from my house, and it's actually a really great filming location. So, East Park, thank you. As per the schedule, we're now going through another tier list video in which we're going to discuss the shoulders. Before we get into it, I'm going to clarify a couple of things. One, we're not going to place mass amounts of emphasis on the traps, although we will be discussing things like shrugs, just because it's very heavily linked to upper back work, a lot of retraction work, so it's kind of already been covered. Second thing is not going to talk about the rear delts. We spoke about rear delts when looking at the back video previously. I don't want to double up and speak about them again. You know my stance on rear delts. Probably not worth doing face pulls if you want to build your rear delts. Do rear delt flies instead. Sick. Now, what we're going to do is going to go through the shoulders. And that's going to primarily look at two things, being the front delts and the side delts. Shoulders are kind of split into, I guess, three heads, if you want to call it that way. Anterior, lateral, posterior. I can't reach that far around. I'm sore. Front, side, rear. And we're going to isolate the front and the side today, which are probably the ones you're most concerned about considering we've already covered the rear. First on the list is a very common movement many of you are going to be doing, which is going to be the seated dumbbell shoulder press. I'm doing seated for a reason. I'm going to discuss that later. But one of the great things about shoulder pressing is everyone has this idea that shoulder pressing is just going to heavily bias the anterior delts between the front of your shoulders without any emphasis elsewhere. That's not true. Essentially, what you can do with a shoulder press is you can almost dictate where emphasis is being placed based on your upper arm angle. If you were shoulder pressing with a bit more of a tucked upper arm, you're going to shift a lot more emphasis to the anterior delts here. Fantastic. But if you kind of go out like so, a flared upper arm, you're going to shift a lot more emphasis to the lateral delts, which is nice. Obviously, you're still going to get anterior delt work in there. You cannot bias a single head in that case, but you can shift more emphasis over to one than the other. Very cool, we like that. The downside with a dumbbell shoulder press, although a bloody fantastic movement, is stability can get a bit questionable at times. One of the issues I have with shoulder pressing, especially with dumbbells, is when I get to a certain weight, I do get a bit wobbly. And when I get a bit wobbly, things get a bit hard, and I do not want my shoulder growth or shoulder stimulus to be limited by an external variable. I want my shoulder or the shoulder press to fail because my shoulders have given out, not because I can't stabilize the movement anymore. And that is the biggest hindrance of dumbbell movements, especially when looking at pressing, is stability when you start lifting to a certain extent or certain weight, I should say, will eventually become a concerning factor. And to me, it's just not worth the risk. To be frank with you, this is gonna be a bit of a controversial take here. I haven't done a shoulder press for probably over a year because you actually don't need to do a shoulder press. When you're doing any kind of chest variation, fly, pressing, whatever, your anterior delts are going to be heavily worked. Your shoulder pressing doesn't work your rear delts very well, so that's now ignored. All you have left there to really consider is going to be your lateral delts, which you can work very adequately and actually pretty well doing lateral raise variations instead. So if you don't want to shoulder press, you don't have to. You can shoulder press, and shoulder pressing is good, but you don't have to do it. And with that in mind, with the shoulder press being a good movement, but probably not my favorite movement with the dumbbell anyway, we're going to rank it as a B tier movement. To the machine. Next on the agenda, so having done a dumbbell shoulder press, we're now moving on to a machine. Everything I've mentioned previously in the dumbbell shoulder press still applies here. The big difference that we want to acknowledge is the stability. So now you're not utilizing dumbbells, so free weights, you're actually in a fixed path via a machine. The movement is going to be a lot more stable, which basically takes all of the good from the dumbbell shoulder press and removes all of the concern, being the potential external limiters of stability. Immediately, that's obviously going to place it higher up in the list of good versus bad, because the one concern I had previously mentioned was the fact that I don't want my shoulders to fail due to a stability demand. I want them to fail due to muscular failure, essentially milking the amount of stimulus they're experiencing from the movement, which is only going to be limited if something prevents them from yielding full stimulus due to an external variable impacting failure, i.e. losing stability versus actually reaching a point of muscular fatigue. Same rules still apply. When you have a machine that has altering handles, you can still press with either tucked arm path or a wider arm path, depending on what muscles you'd rather place more bias on or towards. Again, that's very much dependent on your goals. With that, I would say we're going to give this an S, as S tier movement, because again, although we don't need to do a shoulder press, we know that when looking at effective movement for hypertrophy, this has very few limiters and also works a muscle very effectively, ultimately deeming it to be superb. S, superb. Yes, say nod. Yeah, thank you, he nodded. Next on the list is a bit of an uncommon movement. This is typically actually done seated. I'm going to do it standing purely because I don't want to drag a bench all the way over here, which is actually quite a distance. This is going to be a cable Y raise. Again, this works a few muscles. We're doing this more for the purpose of working the lateral delts here, but it will work things like your lower traps and whatnot. But for this video, we're doing it for the lateral delts. It is a slightly different movement. Takes you through a slightly different range of motion. A lot of times when you do lateral raises, you're kind of going from a lengthened position or a more lengthened position up to contraction. This eliminates that lengthened range entirely and just focuses on basically shortened to more shortened range, being up here to here. I like it because it's slightly different. And I think one of the big things that's commonly overlooked when looking at effective programming or just training in general is an element of enjoyment or doing some novel movements which are either quite fun to learn or quite fun to do. This can be both of those things. And although it may not be the most effective lateral delt movement in the world and maybe doesn't take it through enough of a range in the lengthened position or slightly more lengthened position, does it matter? Is it that deep? Probably not. And like I said, although I would favor doing it seated, the reason why I want to do it seated is because it helps you remove other body parts that could assist with the movement. When you do it standing, you're more likely to lean back, you're more likely to jolt your legs around, therefore kind of adding an element of momentum, which can obviously reduce the amount of tension the muscle is experiencing because momentum is coming from elsewhere. If you do it seated, it removes that, or at least reduces that to the point where more tension is going to be placed on the muscle throughout and other muscles are going to be less likely to assist. But as previously mentioned, I cannot be bothered to go get a bench, so we're going to do it standing. Stability is less of a consideration here, but one thing that is a consideration is actually going to be grip. Where you're holding it, with a lot of pressure going down into the thumb, grip could be a limiting factor. And although it is a lateral raise variation or a shoulder variation in itself, I would consider strapping up just to help remove grip as a potential limiter because we don't want that external variable to hold us back. A bit of a controversial one, but this is my opinion. Remember that this video is purely my opinion. Doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. I'm simply presenting mine. I'm going to give it an A for a very good movement. Help me, I'm anxious. This is another pressing variation, and this is one many of you may like. And everyone has this idea that because they may perceive movements to be like compound movements, they're by default better. We're going to discuss that. The standing overhead press with a barbell. A lot of people would deem things like a pull-up, overhead press, barbell row, bench press, squat, deadlift as like the big core movements because those are the best movements for building muscle. I want you to define and explain why. Why are they the best movements? And whatever explanation you come up with, it's probably not going to be entirely true. Ultimately, your body doesn't really identify, I'm doing this with a barbell and a free weight, therefore it must be better. Your body is going through ranges of motion against resistance. It's not thinking as much as you are. One trap a lot of people fall into is they get married or emotionally married to certain movements by saying, I have to do this to grow my shoulders, X, Y, Z. Quite frankly, the barbell overhead press when looking at hypertrophy and building the shoulders is pretty pants. And the reason why I say that is because depending on how strong you are, you're going to face or be presented with a massive external limiter here, which is going to be your core. When you are standing, not only are you reducing stability, because obviously you're standing, you don't have back support, X, Y, Z, you're also going to be implementing a lot of core muscles, which in turn have the potential to limit how close you can take this to failure. When I'm doing an overhead press with a barbell, for example, and I'm getting close to failure, what happens is I tend to lean back more and more. I'm shifting into unfavorable positions, and my core is probably fatiguing, or my core muscles are probably fatiguing more than my shoulders are, thus actually taking emphasis away from what I'm trying to achieve. I'm reducing how much stimulus my shoulders are going to experience because my core is going to fatigue first, and therefore the movement is not failing because my shoulders have failed or have reached a point of near failure. The movement is failing due to an external limiter, which again is kind of what we want to avoid. So not only do we have stability to be considered here, we also have further external muscles limiting the movement's effectiveness, which in turn, in my opinion, controversial here, is going to rank it now as a D tier movement. Do I program it for some people? Yeah, I do, because they want to do it. And do I think it is okay? I mean, yes, it is okay. I might argue it's a C tier movement, but I'm kind of putting it into D. But everything this movement does can be done better with a machine. Machines are more stable, machines reduce how many other external muscles are going to be limiting you, and everything that's bad about this is fixed elsewhere. D for delts, not very good for the delts though. A movement that people commonly demonize, and that's the barbell upright row. Oftentimes people online have demonized this movement because they deem it to be bad for the shoulder or could potentially cause shoulder injuries. Quite frankly, is the movement the problem, or are you maybe the problem there? Are movements inherently bad for you when it comes to injuries, or is it how they are done? In a lot of cases, I believe it may be the latter. The upright row, quite frankly, is actually a pretty solid movement. It's not something I include regularly just because I just prefer lateral raises, but when looking at what it's trying to achieve, it takes your upper arm through a very similar movement pattern as a lateral raise will. Because we know the upper arm is going through a very similar motion, we know that it's going to work similar muscles, which means it's going to shift a lot of emphasis to the lateral delts. And if you're looking at doing a lateral delt work, I think it's a pretty good alternative. You essentially have three real things to consider. A raise variation, like side raise, Y raise, whatever, a shoulder press variation with a wide arm path, or an upright row variation. Any of them are fine. It ultimately comes down to what you enjoy the most and what you feel like you can progress most with. It's key to note when doing an upright row. It's a movement where you're probably going to lift a little bit more weight than you're expecting to, which means it's also a movement that's probably going to be consumed by your ego. No one cares how much you upright row. If you're throwing and bouncing yourself around just to lift an extra plate either side, No one cares. You have to consider what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to target. Do not sacrifice shoulder stimulus for the sake of additional momentum just because you want to lift more weight. That also, when looking at the realm of progressive overload, that also hinders us because ultimately, when we're trying to progress and build muscle, we want to identify progressive overload as the key variable to measure here, which is have you done more weight or more reps? We want that increase in reps or weight to come from the muscles because they've grown and therefore are able to output more force and have got stronger. We don't want that to come due to a technical change, which is why I always preach the importance of standardization. If your technique is not standardized, you do not know if you've progressed due to progression or you've progressed due to doing something differently, and maybe even worse. So do not let movement and momentum take away from quality just to lift extra weight, when in reality, all you're doing is holding your own gains back. I think I'm actually going to put the upright row as an A tier movement. Although back in the day, I probably would have ranked it a lot lower. In recent months, my mind is changing and I'm probably going to bump it up to A. Barbell shrug. How many times have you seen a gym bro around your gym load up like 5 plates aside and shrugging like that, you know, where the chicken neck goes like that? Don't do it. Everyone has this idea, and we're not really going to touch on traps too heavily here because we've covered traps a lot in the upper back video, but I wanted to touch on the shrugs. So many people will utilize a barbell shrug, standing barbell shrug, as a really effective trap builder, but in reality, that's probably not the case. They actually had they theorized here that, and you can actually kind of put this into play slightly. If you were to have your shoulders down as so, and just elevate your traps like so, or elevate your shoulders and shrug up like so, your traps don't contract massively, your upper traps anyway. Technically, this is a bit of an argument online. Your upper traps are actually much higher up. These are actually defined as your mid traps, apparently. But I'm not going to get into that. But your traps don't contract massively. Whereas if you retract your shoulder blades more like so, your traps tend to contract a lot more, which is why people actually theorize that doing things like rows or doing things like Kelso shrugs, where you're basically chest supported on an incline bench, retracting, were actually much better movements when considering trap recruitment and development versus a standing barbell shrug. The other thing to consider there is, do you really need to train your traps directly? Your traps are going to get heavily utilized when doing side raise variations. Your traps are going to get heavily utilized when doing any kind of rowing variation because you're going through a lot of retraction there. Therefore, because they're being heavily utilized, do you need to train them directly, very much like the anterior delts, which I'm going to discuss shortly? The answer for most people is probably not. I have not done a shrug or a shrug variation or direct trap work, external to rowing variations for years, probably 7+ years, and my traps, they're doing okay. And ultimately, it really comes down to your movement section through other means. If you are doing a lot of wide grip rowing, and a lot of heavy retraction-based rowing stuff in your back days or pull days, your traps are going to be worked adequately. You do not need to barbell shrug to work them even more. If you want to do them purely for enjoyment, because you like lifting loads of weight and looking kind of cool and maybe bending some bars, because if the bar ain't bending, you're just pretending, remember that, then sure, go for it. Enjoyment's definitely a factor to consider. But if you really want to actually develop your traps, don't deep shrugs, do other things instead. I'm going to give the shrugs a D for dudes ego lifting in the gym because they think lifting lots on a shrug is cool when it's not. Next on the list, we finally got there, lateral raises. We're actually going to talk about the dumbbell lateral raise first, and I'll be quite blunt with you. I love it. I think it's a fantastic movement. I think it's arguably one of my favorite lateral raise variations, just because it's easy to set up, bloody good for its intended purpose, and you look pretty cool doing it. And that's what really matters, is how cool you look when doing a movement. The thing I want to note, and the kind of thing I want to address here, is a lot of people when they're lateral raising will lateral raise directly out to the side. That's fine, you can do that if you want to, but that in turn can, in my opinion anyway, recruit a lot of the traps or encourage the traps to take over, be that through maybe some subconscious retraction, elevation occurring, whatever it may be. And I find that quite problematic because my traps give out quite quickly. They also take over from a lot of movements because they're quite overdeveloped. I don't want that. So what I do is to kind of cue me out of that is I think about raising out to the corners of the room. So rather than directly to the side, I'm thinking about more 40 degrees in front of me, almost as if I'm trying to touch the corners of the room. Keep my shoulders down to limit elevation and almost trying to reach my arms out. It won't necessarily shift more emphasis over to the lateral delts. It will just help reduce the involvement of external variables such as the traps. So although out to the side and more in front are both equally good in my opinion for the lateral delts, one just reduces trap recruitment, which in my opinion makes it a little bit better and more favorable. Again, another common thing I see people using here, forgetting to use I should say, is straps. Your grip is being used. And when I say to people, strap up doing a dumbbell lateral raise, everyone says, well, that sounds silly. Try it and then tell me how silly it sounds when it feels better. It's an S. We're not even gonna piss around basically, it's an S. Just a great movement. You can do them seated, you can do them standing, you can do them on an incline bench, you can do them face down, you can do them upside down and backwards, and maybe even wearing a mankini if you wanted to. But either way, S tier movement, because they're bloody good, and most of my clients probably have a lateral raise variation depending on what they're trying to achieve. I have many. Following on from the previous video where I discussed the dumbbell lateral raise, I spoke about how you can do many different variations. One of the variations I want to implement or even address or show here is going to be the cable lateral raise. And although you can do it in many different ways, I think is another good variation many people neglect to include. Again, there's an argument here that implementing unilateral work, being one side at a time, can potentially result in greater stimulus for growth due to more motor unit recruitment, as only one side is going to be the focal point here. Is that true or not? I'm not sold, I'm not certain, but I understand the theory behind it. So with that in mind, I think it's also important to include a unilateral variation throughout these videos for you to basically determine and dictate whether you want to implement them for whatever reason that may be. The thing with the cable lateral raise is, I think there's an argument here you could probably place a little bit more emphasis on the length and range here. There's a bit of an argument there actually, in which you can't actually fully stretch the lateral delts. Try and stretch your delts. If I want to stretch my delts, I will have to take my arm so far across my body, I actually am not capable of doing so. So to stretch my lateral delts doesn't really work, hence why stretch-mediated hypertrophy isn't really a consideration for the lateral delts. But what you can do is put more emphasis on the length and range, being that bottom portion, and how you manipulate your body will essentially allow you to do so, especially when we're looking at a cable lateral raise variation. With a dumbbell lateral raise, your tension will drop off about here when your arm is straight down to the ground. With a cable, because you can angle yourself accordingly and adjust cable height, you can actually allow that tension to start a bit further across, thus being a bit more length and position dominant, which could be a nice fun variation to include, or potentially a variation to consider when looking at providing additional or varying stimulus when looking at the lateral delts. Do you need to do any of what I've just said? Probably not. I'm just presenting it in case you want to, because I do it and maybe someone else wants to do it too. I'd actually also double up here and put the cable lateral raise as another, and thinking of a word for S. It's going to be S tier. We know it's going to be S tier, but I need to think of another word for S. Slimy. S for really good, basically. It's very good. A movement that's actually not inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with this movement, but it's a movement that people utilize when they probably don't need to. But when doing something like a front raise, for example, which is very much an anterior bias movement, why? This is a movement I see a lot of people implement where they'll just front raise the up like so. And in reality, because it shifts so much emphasis and bias to the anterior delts, which we know are already getting heavily worked through other movements, it just makes you question why you do it. Because I don't think I've ever met anybody who has underdeveloped anterior delts. With that in mind, the movement itself is actually fine. If, for whatever reason, you do have underdeveloped anterior delts, doing a cable front raise, a dumbbell front raise, a front raise variation of sorts is a really good option, a really good consideration when pondering developing that area. But with the consideration that you probably don't need to because your anterior delts are probably developed enough, you just don't need to. So it's hard here because the movement itself, I would say, is probably like an A-tier movement. Like a front raise variation is an A-tier movement regarding how well it targets the tendon musculature and also how well it serves its purpose. But because people don't really need to do it, I was going to put it much lower down the list because people don't need to do it. But again, this list is based on effectiveness, not based on whether it should be programmed or not. But just because it's a good movement for what it does, doesn't mean you should do it, because you probably don't need to target your anterior delts directly outside of whatever chest work you're already doing, and maybe a shoulder press if you want to. So for that reason, it's still going to be an A-tier movement, but it's a movement I wouldn't program. Cracker, I'd save the best one for last. But basically, when I was going through school and I used to see people go to the gym, I was like, wow, that's so cool. They always used to do this stupid movement where they hold a dumbbell up and they're pretending they're driving a car. Yeah, you know what I mean, the steering wheel. You know, yeah, you've seen it, he knows it. Right, that's Ryder, by the way, Ryder's here. So the old steering wheel movement. Honestly, this is a prime example of just because it's hurting doesn't mean it's working effectively. When you're holding tension for a significant period of time, as you are, because there is no point in this movement in which tension is being relieved, you're going to accumulate a lot of lactic acid buildup, which is going to burn a lot. And this is where the mistake lies, is people then feel, because it's burning a lot and they feel a lot of sensation, by default the movement must be really effective for its intended purpose. But it's not. When we look at effective movements, one of the considerations we have there is it taking the intended musculature, in this case it's going to be the anterior delts, through a relevant range of motion. This would be a relevant range of motion, this would be a relevant range of motion. It does neither of those things. It holds a point of tension in this shortened range here and just holds it there for the entirety of the movement, where you just, for whatever reason, rotate your hands looking like a bit of a sausage. A lot of burning, a lot of sensation, but does not work the target musculature effectively, nor is it particularly convenient when considering progressive overload. Is how do you actively progressively overload that? You can hold heavier weight, you can hold it for longer, you could twist more maybe. Is that, no, none of those are really forms of progressive overload. Like, it just doesn't really work. I think with that in mind, although it feels good, you probably get a nasty pump from it, don't do it. You just look like a bit of a sausage. If you want to drive a car, get in your car and drive home, because that's menacing behaviour. Immediately, I don't need to tell you where this is going to be. We know it's going to be a D tier movement. It's going to be D for, if you're going to do this movement, drive home and look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm sorry for all the mistakes I've made, because that is That's a sin. In my land, that is a sin. All right, so that is essentially the video. The thing I want to stress, like with all my videos, is just my opinion. Doesn't mean I'm right, doesn't mean I'm wrong, doesn't mean you're right, doesn't mean you're wrong. It's simply an opinion based on the evidence I've seen, the studies I've read, and also anecdotal experience. I think that does count for something, especially when you work with many clients. The thing is, I don't think inherently any of these movements are particularly that bad. Apart from the steering wheel one, that is crap. Outside of that, all of the movements are fine. It's just depending on their intended purpose. I'm speaking purely from an opinion-based idea of hypertrophy. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, it's just simply what I believe. And let me know in the comment section below, what is your favorite shoulder movement? Also let me know why. Until the next one, thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my waffle about shoulders and stuff. And thank you for tolerating the video. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Please click the link down in the description, also the comment section for TFNL coaching, which will be linked down below. Please do that, otherwise I'll cry. Thank you. Bye.